Is Thank you very much. That was very thanks, very. I was going to mention that the call is being recorded. My name's Ewan. I'm a part of the Trade Union Labour Environmentalism Network, and we're all really glad to be joined today by three, I should say, three great speakers who present two papers to us. For those of you that are not familiar with the Trade Union Environment and Labour Environment Network, we're a research network set up by early career researchers who study the role of labour and the trade union movement in addressing the climate crises. One of my colleagues from the network will be able to put a link to our website in the chat. Feel free to check out our website and also sign up to our regular newsletter. We're going to be opening up invitations to join the network soon as well, so please do sign up to our mailing list. Today's event is the latest in a series we've ran this year, where we've invited high-profile speakers. Our previous events appear online, the recordings of them appear online, and we're recording this session, which will also appear online in the very near future. I'm really encouraged that we've got a cracking turnout today, and I'm very excited to make a start. So today's event brings together insights from two regions that are grappling with the realities of energy transitions in order to understand what a just transition looks like for workers and communities. The cases we're looking at today are both looking at the closure of nationally and regionally important workplaces, specifically oil refineries. So I'm delighted, first of all, to welcome Dr. Jessie HF Hammerling, who will present on the Contra Costa Refinery Transition Partnership, which was formed in 2020. After the closure in 2020 mass layoffs at a major California refinery. Jessie is currently the co-director of the Green Economy Programme at the UC Berkeley Labor Center and works in collaboration with government, industry, unions and community stakeholders to understand the impacts of the energy transition. Alongside Jessie, we're also joined by Dr. Ewan Gibbs and Riyoko Shibe, who will present their research on Scottish oil refinery workers after the 2023 Grangemouth closure announcement. In their paper, they'll highlight how workers' frustration with just transition promises and a feeling of exclusion from key decisions characterised their experiences. Ewan's a senior lecturer in economic and social history at University of Glasgow, as a historian of energy, industry, work and protest. And he's also published his first book, Coal Country, The Meaning and Memory of Deindustrialisation in Post-War Scotland. And Riyoko Shibe is a Scottish graduate, School of Social Sciences funded doctoral researcher at the University of Glasgow and has recently published an article in Enterprise and Society on the Grangemouth dispute. Together, Ewan and Riyoko have also published a really good article in Antipode that I would also recommend you all to read. In terms of the format for today, we've up to 1 hour and 30 minutes for the event. Jessie is going to kick us off and she's going to be followed by Ewan and Riyoko. Each presenters will have 20 minutes and they're also going to give us some national context to their case studies, given that we have quite an international audience in the call today. After the presentations, we'll then open up the floor to questions. So without further ado then, I'd like to invite Jessie to make a start. If you could just share your screen and your slides, Jessie, and take it away whenever you're ready.
Thanks. All right, here we go. Try that one more time. Okay. Great. Thanks so much for the intro and thanks to you all for being here. It's really great to have this opportunity to share and discuss our work with colleagues working on these issues all over the world. Yeah, I'm excited to get started. So I am just by way of introduction, so I'm Jessie Hammerling. I lead the UC Berkeley Labor Center's Green Economy Program. So the Labor Center is an applied research and education organization at UC Berkeley. So in addition to research and technical assistance for policymakers, for unions, for other organizations, our group also does leadership development for unions and student programming on labor studies. And the Green Economy program specifically is focused on labor market impacts of the energy transition and developing strategies to advance a just transition and make sure that we are building a more equitable economy as we decarbonize. My background is I have a master's degree in public policy and a PhD in geography. And I've spent most of my career in this type of applied labor and economic research. So I've done some work in other areas, including technological change, data and algorithms, outsourcing. But I'm very glad to have returned to this work in climate and energy, which is where I started off professionally. So today I'm going to talk about a 3-year multi-stakeholder research and organizing project that we concluded earlier this year that was focused on refinery transition planning in the San Francisco Bay Area. This slide shows the 2 final reports of the project, which I'll be discussing. And I'll say this is sort of a meta presentation, so not so in-depth on the research findings, which encompass several different research projects, but kind of an overview of what we found and also how we approached the work of the partnership and the project. So first, I'll just start with some context, origins, goals of the partnership. Then I'll discuss our process of sort of integrated research and learning and the various research projects we did. Then I'll talk about what we found, what were some of the outcomes, the findings of this work and the recommendations, and then end with outcomes and lessons learned. So first, origins, context, and goals here. And this is just to set some context and with remembering that this is a crowd coming from all over the world. So this is the San Francisco Bay Area. So San Francisco would be just to the left here across the bay. And this is Contra Costa County is what's shown here, along with the oil refineries in the region, including one across the bay to the north in Solano County, the Valero Benicia refinery. So this is really has been the oil refining hub for Northern California for over 100 years. There's also a cluster of refineries in Southern California in and around Los Angeles, but this is really where oil refining has happened here in the Bay. What this map is showing is data from a tool called the CalEnviro Screen, California Environmental Screen, which is a mapping tool that helps identify California communities that are most affected by multiple sources of pollution and where people are especially vulnerable to pollution's effects. So it uses environmental, health, and socioeconomic information to produce scores for every census tract in the state, ranking them. And these areas near the Contra Costa refineries are among the most burdened, the sort of top ranked in terms of the worst on the CalEnviro screen. They're some of the most pollution burdened and sort of most socioeconomically burdened as well. So this map is one way of illustrating 2 of the underlying and interconnected challenges that are facing this region in particular, which is stark economic inequality. So a really big gap between these blue areas, which also, if you were just looking at wealth, you would see that these blue areas with the low CalEnviro screen score are also very wealthy, and these darker red areas, most of which are near the refineries and the industrial lands near the refineries, where folks are suffering from a higher pollution burden and health consequences as a result of that. It's more likely to be low-income populations, people of color, and also immigrants who live in those areas. So that's just a little bit of the context and also sort of the underlying conditions in which transition is happening here in the region. Some additional context that's important here. One, of course, is climate change, which is happening, and the impacts are very real and very real in California, right? As we were releasing this work, the LA fires broke out in January, and it's just the latest in a string of escalating impacts of climate change and escalating costs. So this is obviously a really important contextual feature here. And the second piece is that California as a state has really been a national leader within the US on climate goals and policies for a long time, including the landmark Global Warming Solutions Act in 2006, sort of first set the first emissions targets and reductions targets in the country. And then more recent actions, such as a mandate in California to shift to all new car sales must be zero emission vehicles by 2035. So these and other policies have already started California on a path towards increasing updates of zero emission vehicles and renewable energy and reducing fossil fuel emissions in the state. So this is already in motion. Against this backdrop, we have one of the refineries, the Marathon Refinery in Martinez, which is one of the towns in Contra Costa County, announced that it would idle in 2020. The beginning of COVID, but it was also citing reduction in gasoline demand. And over 700 workers were laid off with the minimum legally required notice, which is about 6 weeks. And it was really shocking, devastating. These facilities have been open for, in many cases, many decades to over 100 years. So people were not expecting it. It was very difficult for workers to find jobs. Workers were really willing to get retrained and to go into different industries, but there just weren't a lot of options. So within a year, we found around 3/4 of workers had gotten new jobs. But those who had gotten new jobs, they were mostly lower quality and much lower paid jobs. So workers took an average of 24% pay cut in their new jobs. And most of the new jobs, unlike their jobs at the refinery, were no longer represented by a union. Workers also reported health and safety issues at their new jobs. That was a big change. The health and safety culture had been really important to workers at the Marathon facility. And just, again, overall, really a disruptive event for families and whole communities, just devastating consequences for people financially, emotionally, et cetera. And another feature here is that the company actually barred workers from transferring to other Marathon is the company, Marathon-owned facilities, because they didn't want workers from the unionized facility going to work in non-union facilities owned by the same company. So in the aftermath of the layoffs, labor and environmental justice groups in Contra Costa County came together in a partnership to focus on transition-related questions and planning. So they formed the Contra Costa Refinery Transition Partnership. So these are the members. It includes the Steelworkers Union that represents the operators and the sort of main permanent staff on site at the refineries. UA Local, which is the plumbers and pipe fitters and steam fitters, which represent a lot of the workers that come in and do construction maintenance and service at the refineries. The California Federation of Labor Unions, the Contra Costa Labor Council, the Asian Pacific Environmental Network, which is a local and statewide environmental justice organization, the Blue Green Alliance, a labor and environmental justice coalition group that operates nationally, who acted as the convener of this partnership, and then the UC Berkeley Labor Center, who was the research lead. So some of these groups, in particular the Steelworkers and Asian Pacific Environmental Network, had worked together before. So this wasn't the first time that they had come together, in particular around refinery health and safety issues. They had found a lot of common ground, right? Preventing accidents, improving air quality, et cetera. But they were often at odds around refinery regulations and clearly have some different interests in terms of how quickly they would like the refineries to shut down. APEN, has been a strong advocate for improvements in public health and, fighting environmental injustice in communities like those surrounding the refineries. But they came together in this partnership with the common ground here of needing information about how transition was unfolding and needing to develop a plan that would actually work for working class people in the region. So these are the formal goals of the partnership that the partners agreed on. So build relationship between impacted workers and frontline community organizations, commission targeted research to inform potential policy actions and to have a shared basis for discussion about the impact, pace, and scale of refinery transition. Develop a package of recommendations in areas of consensus for meeting the needs of refinery workers and communities in the fossil fuel transition, including an equitable economic development strategy. Commission research to develop a high road and just transition strategy to envision a new economy that works for workers and communities, and chart action steps, and then assess strategies to implement the recommendations. So those are the goals that the partnership set out for itself. And next I'll talk about what we did and how we did it. So we completed 5 distinct research projects as part of this work, each of which serves a specific purpose in the context of the project. So some of these, the ones that are underlined on this slide, were our publications, and the others were sort of inputs into the other pieces of it. So in more or less chronological order, the first study was the fossil fuel layoff study. This was a survey of the workers who were laid off from the Marathon Martinez refinery. We followed them 1 year after the layoffs and did both focused interviews and a representative survey of those workers to understand what their job search was like, what challenges they faced, what jobs they had found. And to our knowledge, this was, the first kind of study of its kind of laid off fossil fuel workers and what happened to them in the aftermath. And this was about understanding the impacts of refinery closures on workers. And this study was really, an alarm bell for the region and kind of the thing that got the project started. So this came out in 2023. We just really didn't have a lot of hard information about how difficult it would be for workers to transition into other jobs, but this gave us some really concrete information. The second piece was the refinery transition analysis that was completed by energy economists who were with the Colorado School of Mines. And the goal of this study was to anticipate future changes at the Bay Area refineries. So this study helped establish among the partnership a common understanding that energy transition changes are already in motion, right? I think there had been, a fair amount of, I don't know if denial or sort of lack of acknowledgement that the transition away from fossil fuels would be leading to refinery closures. And we took a hard look at the information about California's existing climate policies, not anything additional that's planned, and how it was likely to affect the market. And this really helped lay out the inevitability that more closures are likely to come. And so establishing this, really breaking it down and helping everybody in the partnership understood it. They didn't all agree about how fast and exactly how transition should happen. But they could all see that transition is unfolding and that California is on this path and the industry is on a path that will lead to additional closures. The third piece was research on the impacts of the refinery industry, so anticipating the impacts of additional closures on the local economy and public health. And this part's tricky because sometimes these impact studies are used to kind of paint the refinery industry in a good light, right? They're good employers. They can contribute all these good jobs and all of this local tax revenue. And that obviously wasn't our intent here. The point was instead to be really clear-eyed about what the cost of transition would be. So, if, as the previous study lays out, we are anticipating additional refinery closures in the region, what is the cost going to be? What do we need to do to be preparing and planning for interventions here that will actually account for the scale of the economic challenges and the public health challenges that the region is going to face. The next piece was a study of decommissioning and cleanup. And so this was really taking a close look at, okay, if there's facilities that are going to be decommissioned, like what are the existing processes and scenarios around decommissioning and cleanup? What's it going to take to do it right? How to pay for it? And what are really the risks here? And then the last piece is just transition economic development. And this was really where we synthesized a lot of the research that we did and integrated what we found and used that information and used it to develop a stakeholder-informed framework for economic development planning. And so by that, I mean, we took this information, we actually worked with the folks in the partnership to develop an economic development approach that could achieve just transition outcomes and actually help address the challenges that the region is up against. So next, I'm going to talk about the process, a few key points about the process here. So the research in this case, like I said, this was a 3-year project. So it was an ongoing and integrated part of the work of the partnership. So it wasn't like, see you later, we're going to go do a study, we'll tell you what we found in a few years. The process of designing, conducting, and sharing the findings from each piece of this research was a really important part of the consensus building process and the process of developing the economic development framework and the group's policy recommendations. So it was iterative and ongoing. You know, we were really asking for questions on our research, asking for input on our research questions and approach. We just shared and discussed research learnings as we went, not just when we had a final report. All of this was really critical for establishing that common foundation of understanding of the shared challenges that folks in the partnership were facing in the region. And then there was also a parallel consensus building process that involved a wider group of stakeholders in the region to develop policy recommendations, a comprehensive set of policy recommendations about just transition. Okay, so findings. So this is, you saw the research projects. Here's one slide on the findings. So this is a very high level summary of what we learned from all of those many research projects over several years. But the first key point is that refinery transition is happening, right? And we've already seen this. And since we released the report, there have been additional announcements of facilities planned closures in California. So refinery transition is underway. Additional facility closures within the Contra Costa and Solano region are likely by 2045 because of declining demand for the key products that these facilities produce, which is gasoline. So the potential outcome that our study found is that by 2045, there may be one large or potentially two smaller Bay Area oil refineries, and there may be some alternative fuels production here, but that's not likely to be a factor that will enable all of these facilities to continue operating. The second set of findings here is about the consequences. So an analysis of the economic and public health impacts of the refinery industry and its supply chain in Contra Costa. We found that the industry is an important source of well-paying jobs for workers without a college degree in the county. So there's just not a lot of other good options for workers without a college degree, for blue-collar workers to have a job that pays decent wages, offers benefits, you know, health and safety protections on the job, and really pays enough to live in the Bay Area, which is a very expensive place to live, really high cost of housing, et cetera. There just weren't a lot of comparable jobs for people to go into. The second set of impacts was on taxes. So revenue from the industry and its supply chain currently, and not just the companies themselves, but really all the economic activity associated with the companies, which is pretty substantial, really big number of jobs, including a lot of good union construction sector jobs. And all of that economic activity also contributes to the tax impact here. So the revenue from the industry and supply chain constitute a pretty substantial share of local funding for essential government services, in addition to, I mean, and all of that in turn supports public sector union jobs in the county, right? So that's when these facilities close and the economic activity associated with these facilities decline, it's potentially a big hit for local government tax revenue and ability to fund public services. And then the third set of findings here around health. So obviously the industry and its supply chain contribute to really serious air pollution that has just significant, costly, and unequal public health impacts. So, but that doesn't mean that the risk, public health risk, goes away when a facility closes. And in fact, there's some new risks that are introduced along with decommissioning, specifically related to companies disinvesting in maintenance, so deferring maintenance, understaffing. All of that could lead to accidents, which we are already seeing in the Bay Area. And in addition, just delaying and avoiding cleanup costs at decommissioned facilities, which could also leave toxic sites and present new environmental risks. Okay.
5 minutes, Jessie, if that's okay.
Yep.
5 minutes.
Sounds good. Thanks. All right. So where we landed. Okay. So this slide is a summary of the 31 policy recommendations that the partners came up with, again, over this process of broader stakeholder engagement and then sort of coming together and really workshopping and even wordsmithing each recommendation among the partnership as a whole. We came up with 31 comprehensive just transition policy recommendations. These are the categories in which the recommendations fall, so just a summary of them. So the first, refinery transition planning and oversight. So recommendations about creating more oversight in the refinery transition process and ensuring worker and community needs are at the center. Second is refinery safety net and transition. So building a meaningful safety net and transition support for refinery industry workers who experience layoffs, land use, decommissioning, and cleanup. So ensuring communities aren't left with the cost of cleaning up contaminated lands and ensuring that lands can be repurposed for new development and community needs. Refinery community support and transition. So this is about recommendations to support frontline communities, help them recover from the disproportionate health impacts, lost tax revenue, and ensure that they have a voice in future economic development planning. And then the last set of recommendations is specifically around economic development, right? Building the next economy and doing it in a way that achieves just transition outcomes, helps account for these challenges, and really meets the needs of workers and communities in the region, right? And all of this is it's not something that the region can do on its own. It's going to require state and to the extent possible, federal support to build the next economy and help the region get through the fiscal crisis here and help workers and communities to come out of this hole. The next piece here is specifically diving in on the economic development priorities. So we synthesized the findings from the research projects, and out of that, we developed a specific priorities. And then the next slide will show the actual framework around just transition economic development planning. And so these are the three priorities. It seems simple, but it took a lot to actually get us here. Of the three core priorities that the partnership agreed should be the guiding principles for just transition planning in the region. So, and some of the thinking here is that, we know in the research on the impacts, everything that I laid out on the findings slide before, Contra Costa is up against a lot of challenges, but it's also a moment of opportunity for the region. So as the county prepares for contraction in this industry, it actually has an opportunity to address some of those underlying challenges that I presented on the very first slide here with the map. As it prepares to plan for the future, right? It can address inequality. It can address public health inequities. So this really represents sort of the promise and potential of the transition, right? It's going to be really hard, but it also offers a chance to really think how the economy here is structured and address some of those structural inequities. And so the guiding principles that this partnership agreed on that should really be sort of the guiding light of an economic development strategy here. The first principle is good jobs. So increasing quality jobs and ensuring that those jobs are accessible to those who need them most, including both displaced refinery workers and workers from historically marginalized communities. The second is healthy communities. So stop the pollution of land, air, and water in areas that have had disproportionate pollution burdens and target environmental and health improvements in those areas. And the third is economic resilience. So reduce economic dependency on fossil fuel production by diversifying the economy and increasing other sources of revenue. So the goal here is, as you think about economic development, as the region thinks about economic development, it should be looking to prioritize things that fall in the middle of this Venn diagram. This slide is the whole framework around it. So I'm not going to talk through all of this. I don't have time. But just to lay it out, this is sort of what we built out and elaborated on, starting with those three priorities, and then laying out what are really the principles for how to approach economic development planning. What are some policy tools that can help achieve those outcomes and ensure you're aiming for those priorities in terms of what you're investing in and how you're actually pursuing those investments, what kind of standards you put on investments, what are your input processes. In terms of strategies, we didn't prescribe specific types of activities or industries for economic development. We sort of laid out like an assessment of a menu of potential options based on what exists and sort of what are some of the approaches that they might take towards economic development in relation to different kinds of infrastructure activities and industries that could potentially help support just transition priorities. And then we talked about some next steps. So happy to discuss this more in questions. And then I'll just wrap up very quickly with the outcomes so far and lessons learned. So, the impacts of this are just unfolding now. It's a very live conversation, especially with the announcement of the Valero facility announcing that it intends to close. And there have been additional closures in Southern California or planned closures in Southern California. So all of this is very live. Our research has already informed new statewide and union-led programs to support displaced workers in the oil and gas sector. Groups involved in the partnership have led regional economic development planning processes. Our team has launched new projects in the region focused specifically on manufacturing and clean energy sector manufacturing strategies to support just transition outcomes in the region. So diving in on one potential sector and doing some strategic planning and technical assistance there. And then, we're continuing to disseminate our findings and share with other researchers and folks working on this elsewhere. And then the final slide here is just some lessons learned, right? So what did we learn from this process? It was a very intensive, like I said, like multi-year process here where, there was a lot of stakeholders, a lot of different interests and a shifting political terrain around all of it. But at the core here, the North Star was really centering the leadership of the folks who were most affected by transition. So the workers and the communities who really live near the refineries and that their interests were really at the core here and they were guiding this work. We use research to establish common knowledge as this foundation for building common ground among groups with some disparate interests and ways and approaches towards this particular topic. Trust building was really important. That's not something you can hurry, but you do have to sort of keep moving and keep the project going. And, we had goals we set out, but you have to be willing to adapt as the world unfolds around something as complicated as this. And then, fundraising to support a project like this, it was not an insignificant amount of time for all of us. And yeah, just time and trust is what allows you to get to something where, we have a just transition strategy now that is actually endorsed and supported by environmental justice groups and fossil fuel unions in the state of California. And that's a really tremendous foundation to build off of. So I will leave it there. Look forward to questions and discussion.
Thanks, Jessie. That was super. Thank you very much indeed. I do have a few questions, Jessie, but I think what we'll do is we'll have the next presentation, and then we'll come back together for the generation session. Ewan, can you start sharing your screen? Perfect. So our next speakers is Ewan Gibbs and Riyoko Shibe, and they're going to present on the Grangemouth Oil Refinery in Scotland. Take it away, guys.
Thanks very much. So as Ewan said, Ewan Kerr said, we're presenting today on the unjust transition at the Grangemouth Oil Refinery on 29th of April this year, so just 2 or 3 weeks ago. Workers at Grangemouth Refinery were informed by their employer, Petroineos, that refinery had come to an end. It's been reported in the media that some of them found this out in a very impersonal way. They found out by email that more than a century of Scottish oil refining had ceased. The ending of refining was not entirely a surprise, however. The closure of the refinery had been announced in the autumn of 2023. And what we're going to present today is research findings from a series of interviews that we conducted with Grangemouth workers in 2024. So before closure and redundancy had actually taken place, but when the process of closure had begun. For those of you who are not familiar with the geography of Scotland's Central Belt, Grangemouth lies between the two large cities of Edinburgh and Glasgow. It's part of a conurbation, effectively, that meets at the other town of Falkirk. Grangemouth was the home to Scotland's first oil refinery, which opened in 1924, I should say, was opened by the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, which we know today as BP, and it's the town's history is synonymous with the oil sector and related areas of manufacturing. Its population peaked at around 24,000 in the early 1970s, and it's since fallen back to around 16,000 in the last half century. I think the other important thing to signify about Grangemouth and its geography is that it's a port, and the town is on the Firth of Forth. It's on the east coast of Scotland, and it's home to Scotland's largest port. And as the refinery is being closed, it's being replaced, in fact, with a fuels import terminal to import refined hydrocarbon products.
So to give a bit more context, the Grangemouth Refinery was opened in 1924 under the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, which became BP in the mid-1950s. And as the last remaining oil refinery in Scotland, this marks the end of a century of oil refining. The refinery is owned by PetroIneos, which is a joint venture between PetroChina, which is a Chinese state-owned oil company, and INEOS, which is a private multinational petrochemical company. And it's a major manufacturing hub consisting of petrochemicals, oil, plastic production, waste incineration, and oil terminals. And these are all very interconnected. The site's closure, the refinery's closure, was announced in November 2023, and at the end of April this year, as Ewan said, the refinery owners notified staff via email that oil refining had come to an end, and that the refinery was now closed. In total, just over 400 direct staff are expected to be made redundant, but estimates suggest that around almost 3,000 jobs are at risk across the whole supply chain. Grangemouth was identified by Scotland's Just Transition Commission, which is an independent advisory board to the Scottish Government, as a litmus test for just transition, but this litmus test has clearly turned red. There's been plenty of room, around 2 years, for the Scottish and UK government to intervene to manage the closure and the transition through injecting emergency public funding or nationalisation, or through delaying the closure. But no action has been taken apart from a report, Project Willow, which was published into industrial opportunity for the site. But this was published in March, just a month before the site closed. Richard Hardy, who is the president of the Scottish Trade Union Congress and a commissioner for the Just Transition Commission, said that Grangemouth is a shining example of how not to do anything, and that a key lesson from how we do change in the future is not to do it like it's been done in Grangemouth. So yeah, a little bit about us. I'm a final year PhD student at the University of Glasgow, researching on the history of Grangemouth since 1950. Specifically the petrochemical industry under BP and how the environment, society and economy have changed through petroleum-based industries. I also started an internship with the Just Transition Commission, researching on just transition funding and green conditionalities for public funding investment into Grangemouth.
I'm a senior lecturer in economic and social history, also at Glasgow University. My background is in researching the long end of the coal mining industry in Scotland during the second half of the 20th century through the prism of deindustrialisation, the contracting significance of mining and manufacturing activities to Scotland's economy and society. But since then, I've also been undertaking research on the longer history of the transition in energy systems in the UK since the middle of the 20th century, understanding how not only the ending of older forms of generation, but the introductions of new ones in hydrocarbons and electricity generation and the nuclear sector and now renewables have led to important changes in labour and employment and restructured community. Given our areas of research background, the Just Transition Commission, which is Riyoko mentioned, is an independent advisory body to the Scottish Government, commissioned us to complete a report understanding how workers have responded to the closure. This took the form of interviewing workers primarily from the refinery, but also who work elsewhere in the petrochemical sector at the Grangemouth complex to understand their responses to the announced closure. We both came at this from a background in researching oral history. So although these interviews were focused around the immediate situation at the refinery and the wider complex, we also asked workers to narrate their life stories to explain what employment at Grangemouth meant to them in the context of the integration of the site into the life of the community, and also to ask them how they understood what a fair future or a just as opposed to unjust transition might look like.
Yeah, so as Ewan said, we interviewed workers across petrochemicals, oil, and the oil terminals. We spoke to 8 workers, and their perspectives were informed by the site's long industrial history. So yeah, as we have said, the refinery opened 100 years ago, and the site's expansion took off after the Second World War, where also Europe's first petrochemical plants were also commissioned in the town. And then in the 1970s, as other industrial communities across Scotland were experiencing contested contraction and closure, Grangemouth was expanding alongside North Sea oil developments, which ran through the site, ending at the Kinneil terminal in the town. So though the refinery was experiencing job losses, the site was still kept open. And then in 2005, BP sold the site to INEOS, the petrochemical company. This history was really central to how workers experienced the closure, and something we were able to capture as historians. The timing was also quite unique. It was immediately after the closure announcement and before concrete decisions were made about the site by government, unions, and employers. And through this, we were able to pull out place and prior experience of industrial change is crucial to workers' conceptualization of justice and injustice.
One of the crucial dynamics of the testimonies, particularly for workers who were also residents of either Grangemouth, Falkirk, or the nearby town of Bo'ness, which most of our respondents were and most of the workforce are, was the integration of the locality and the refinery and the wider complex. Even in its reduced status in the current context of employment that Riyoko explained, it remains the central large workplace, certainly private sector workplace in the locality. So we have 2 quotes from different workers that bring this out, and the first is on the remained visible nature of the refinery and its workforce in the town. So one worker explained that at the end of the shift, at the end of a day shift, you still see a precinct on the high street that's full of workers wearing orange boiler suits going into local businesses and spending money, and he felt there was a retained reciprocity between the workforce and the community. I think the other important element of those narratives was the retained centrality of work and employment at the refinery, especially the provision of what were understood to be high quality apprenticeships and work opportunities. So the second quote, the bottom quote on this slide, comes from a worker who had served an apprenticeship and had then spent the last 10 years or so working at Grangemouth. And they talked about Grangemouth still being seen as a sought after location in local secondary schools, that progressive cohorts of apprentices were still entering the refinery even into the 2020s. So the prospect of job loss was a very real and live one, particularly, I think, to younger workers in their 20s, 30s, and 40s.
Yeah, so on the day of the announcement in September 2023, workers were called into a meeting just before press were told, and were told by their managers that the refinery was going to close. They were shocked, and when we spoke to them a few months later, they described feeling unsettled at how abrupt the decision felt. One shop steward told us that there was never any clear indication or signal from the company before the announcement that they were aiming to close. I think at the core of this reaction is the ownership structures of the company, and the sense that workers aren't consulted on big decisions within this. The refinery is run by a joint partnership between INEOS and PetroChina, which is generally an ownership pattern of in the oil and gas industry in Scotland, where it's characterised and dependent on privately owned companies, which generally lack accountability. This picture on the slide here is the Scottish Cabinet Secretary for External Affairs, Angus Robertson, on the 24th of November, so 2 months after the closure was announced, who met with senior representatives from PetroChina in Beijing to discuss the future of Grangemouth. So against that backdrop, workers told us pretty accurately, I think, that the closure decisions seem to be made elsewhere. Another worker distinguished between local decisions, where plant level management might be consulted, and big decisions like the refinery closure made in boardrooms across the world. The sense of shock was also compounded by this feeling of betrayal. During the COVID pandemic, the site underwent a major restructuring where PetroNeos made 200 redundancies at the refinery, closing one of the catalytic crackers and also a crude oil distillation unit. The company promised they'd invest money into the site, into a new biorefinery, and some workers were swayed by their managers to actually stay in Grangemouth and not move, for instance, offshore or to nearby fossil fuel industries in the area, because Grangemouth was where the workforce was needed. Yeah, I'll pass on to Ewan, who's going to talk about retaining local employment.
Yeah, I think that sense of betrayal that Riyoko mentioned, and the sense of injustice, was propelled by two shared dimensions. So the first was the workers' commitment to retaining local employment, but it was also encouraged by a sense of shock and you know, an outrage at what was seen as the waste of the skills and capacities that had been developed at Grangemouth. I think it's really important to underline here that all of the workers we spoke to expected the transition, especially the younger ones. They underlined that actually they felt they worked in a sector which was well adapted to shifting employment towards greener forms of manufacturing. They felt that the quality of the training that they'd been offered at Grangemouth, that comes through in the first of these quotes at the top of this slide, was well suited to moving towards greener forms of manufacturing. And as Riyoko mentioned, in fact, INEOS had launched a Grangemouth Renaissance project, which put forward, articulated a sense of a future in, for instance, hydrogen production. I think the bottom quote is also significant in underlining the centrality of local employment, but also the understanding of Grangemouth as a key hub of energy production, the role that prior history played in the senses of justice and injustice that were mobilised around the closure. So, you know, when the time comes to move to these industries, why can we not have it in Grangemouth in the same way that a history of shale oil, coal mining and oil refining had been sustained at Grangemouth? The quote, the picture with the quote on it we see here was actually produced by the Union's campaign, Unite's Keep Grangemouth Working campaign this year. I think what's interesting is our quotes came from early last year, before that campaign had begun. So we see those sentiments from individual members of the workforce really collectively by the campaign.
Yeah, so these feelings of shock, betrayal, and the wider waste and loss of local skills and employment really informed workers' ideas of justice in energy transition. In terms of the concept of just transition, not all workers we spoke to had heard that before. And of those who had heard the term, this was generally in terms of top-down government policy commitments rather than a framing that centred workers and trade unions. And workers were naturally sceptical of these processes. They'd heard a lot. If they'd heard the term, they'd heard this being used, but they hadn't seen any active change or real tangible commitments. Their own expressions and understandings of justice were worker-led, and this, as Ewan's just touched on, were articulated through Unite's campaign, Keep Grangemouth Working. And this centred collaboration and consultation with the workforce, keeping the refinery open and planning for a jobs gap and to retain local jobs between the closure and any green industrial future. In Scotland, environmental justice and energy worker activism are quite interwoven. I think Scotland's pretty unique, even compared to England in that sense. The Just Transition Commission comprises of union and environmental representatives. And since it was established in 2019, it's articulated a transition vision shaped by histories of deindustrialisation and centering worker agency and interests in just transition planning. The coalitions fostered by the Scottish Just Transition context and discussions have really helped align workers and environmentalists to recognise this common ground and their interdependent causes. We see this in worker responses to expectations of energy transition in Grangemouth. Many workers expressed that the shift away from fossil fuel production was necessary, an important step, and they anticipated this would happen in their lifetimes and in their careers. And yeah, as highly skilled workers, they felt they were able to be part of this and they wanted to be part of this. But this also led to a frustration that they weren't able to be because of the long-term net zero timelines that were in place with little accountability for fossil fuel sectors and companies to actually abide by them. This quote at the bottom here, I think, sums that up quite nicely. We don't want to come across that we're climate change deniers or anything like that. They couldn't be further from the truth. I don't see this as a question of whether people are for or against the green agenda. I see it as an argument of whether people are for or against jobs in manufacturing.
So the unjust transition at Grangemouth has been characterised importantly by a lack of consultation or meaningful dialogue with the workforce, and also the domination of the town and the site and Scotland's energy economy at large by unaccountable forms of capital. Specifically, we would highlight that ENEOS is a privately listed, not publicly traded company, and also that PetroChina is a foreign state-owned enterprise, and these are important players in both the oil and gas sector, but also actually in various forms in the renewable sector as it's developing in Scotland as well. The fact that these companies are making the crucial decisions on the pace and form the transition takes conditions the injustice that workers experience, and the response has been the articulation of demands for a just transition that are both labour-centric and also locality-centred in the context of Grangemouth, where opposition to job losses also means opposition to a sense of being forced to leave Grangemouth. We spoke to workers who were weighing up the options of having, in their views, to either go and work offshore or perhaps work in oil or other industries in Asia or the Middle East or Australasia. There was a strong sense then of failure on the part of government here to secure jobs and ensure a just transition. And I think importantly, there was a symbiosis then between both the outcome of unjust transition in the form of the closure and redundancies that have been experienced in the last few weeks and months, but also a procedural injustice, that this was a thoroughly undemocratic process and one that denied the legitimacy of collective organisation and trade unions. Thank you very much.
Thanks, guys. That was super again. Those were both fantastic papers. I think really spoke to each other as well. It has occurred to me that there was three quite strong Scottish accents there, so I do hope that everyone was able to keep up as best as possible. I include myself in that as well. Now I think it might be worth. I'll just ask one or two questions to each of the panelists before we open up the floor. I've got about half hour left in the session, so I'll be very, very quick. Thanks for the patience thanks to people's patience on the call. Jessie, I mean, can I maybe start with you? I mean, so I had a look through the list of policy kind of implements policy tools that you kind of outlined or that are outlined in your report, and there are quite a lot of them. I'm just wondering about, in terms of implementation, how do you kind of coordinate between the different agencies and the different levels of government in order to kind of effectively implement here? And does that require an extra level of institutional infrastructure, perhaps, in order to coordinate all these different policies that are so wide ranging and touching so many different areas, so many different policy areas? So how do you coherently bring those together? Can that be done without some extra level of governance?
Yeah, that's a great question. And you can see, and I'll drop a link to both of the final studies into the chat here shortly. But yeah, I think you can see in the recommendations that it is going to take more. Local government can't address this on its own. Local and sort of regional government entities, the county and the municipalities. And this gets at one of the questions that I saw in the chat from Varun, I think, about how prepared they were. I really think our study was a big wake-up call for local government, to be completely honest. I don't think they were prepared. They were caught off guard, just like the workers at the refineries were when the layoff happened in 2020. And I think the last couple of years has really been a process of eye-opening. And we also shared our findings with key local government folks before releasing the final reports to let them know about what we were seeing about the impacts and the likelihood of future refinery closures. So I think one step was getting local government leaders to really understand the scale of the problem, what they could be doing at the local level, and also the limitations of what they would be able to do on their own. And I think we have seen in California, and my opinion based on what we've learned is that the state has not been proactive enough in planning around just transition. They are in the process of a transportation fuels transition planning process. Arguably, this should have happened sooner than it. But we're now seeing these closure announcements, and there's a lot of concern about what it's going to mean for gas prices and supply, and are we going to have to import? And the state's is not prepared. And that doesn't mean that we can't be acting now to protect workers and communities in the face of these closures, and to be proactively preparing. And what we think is really, really missing here is a just transition strategy. I mean, other states in the United States have whole offices dedicated to just transition planning. There's several states that do this as a deliberate planning process and governance entity within the state, and California does not have that. And so I do think there's been a lack of statewide leadership and coordination and proactive planning, both to support workers and communities through these shocks, but also to really be planning around the kind of economic development that these regions are going to need in order to not have this be a really devastating and unequal impacts of the energy transition across the state.
Great stuff. Thank you. And to Ewan and Riyoko, one of the things that comes across in your paper is the workers' desire for the state to take a public stake, if you like, into the Grangemouth Refinery. I'm just wondering, could you guys just briefly reflect for me about the capacity for the UK state to actually do that? I mean, there seems to be a question here about, is the state able to do it? Is the state, the UK state, or what passes for the Scottish state, does that have the capacity, given it's been hollowed out for so many years, to actually do these sort of big interventions?
Okay. I mean, I think it's interesting to maybe start here by noting that the UK government it keeps saying, when it's pressured on Grangemouth, that it's offered £200 million. what that is it's an offer of £200 million in subsidies rather than meaningful, investment capital in the here and now. Now that indicates that resources are there, but there's not a willingness to take that sort of strategic position. And actually, I think that speaks to a larger position in strategic industries in Britain, where government would rather defer responsibility, devolve responsibility to various forms of capital, including state-owned capital from other countries, and then subsidise it. So it's not necessarily a financial case that can't afford it. It's a larger, I think, story about the capacity and willingness to do so. I think the Scottish government, when it comes to Grangemouth, is in a different situation. But on the other hand, you had this ridiculous situation, in my view, where the Scottish government took part in the development of the prospectus project Willow that Riyoko mentioned, which produced essentially a catalogue of options that private industry could at some point invest in the future in Grangemouth, with no timetable, no guarantee. And then just as the Grangemouth refinery was closing, called for nationalisation at the very last minute. And I don't think that's credible or serious either.
I would add as well that I think in the cases where even when money is suggested, there's very little willingness to attach green conditionalities to that funding. So X amount of money might be suggested, but Petroneos was given a lot of loans, grants, even after the refinery was announced to be closed, as green investment. But there's been the refinery is still shut. That's not been connected to keeping jobs, good jobs, quality jobs, or actual green outcomes from that.
Great stuff. Thanks, folks. Okay, I'm happy now to open up questions to the floor. If you could use the hand function, that would be great. I see John there. Have you got a question, John?
Yeah, thanks so much, Ewan. Thanks so much, Jessie. Great, great studies, great work that you're doing. Lots of questions, but let me just cut to the chase here in terms of recommendations, I guess, for other unions about trying to sort of make sure that you're not going to get sideswiped and that you're actually going to get some sort of take up. I guess my first question is how come these unions didn't see that this was coming? I mean, even in the United States and Scotland, you would think with these kinds of major facilities, unions would have some sense about where they are in terms of the infrastructure timeline for this, right? It's very seldom big corporations are going to write off, big facilities like this on a short-term basis, but they will write this stuff off once it's in, 10 or 15 or 20 years down the road in terms of that facility, then, they can possibly be. Is it just that they were, completely bought into the fact that these facilities would never close? I guess that's my one question, right? So certainly in some cases in bargaining or in, there's other discussions in terms of human resource planning, health and safety, that there's usually at least some sort of discussions between management and unions about, what the situation is for that plant, right? And I think so. I'm a bit. I am a bit sort of. I would like to know more about why and how that those unions weren't involved in this or didn't have a sense about what could be coming down the pike. And I guess the second question has to do with what's been the take up. I mean, you've both done these major reports. Jessie, I think yours is probably the most comprehensive one I've seen for any oil and gas workers by far. You've said there's been some at the local level, but who else has bought in? Has there been state interest? Is there congressional interest? Is there Senate type interest? And California has been a major leader on this. And similarly, for Ewan in Scotland, I mean, you do have a Just Transition Commission. You've now seen the impacts of a major closure. Has there been any other sorts of discussions about taking the major proposals and policy proposals much more seriously, as opposed to simply saying, oh, I guess we're closing now. Oh, can we nationalize? Oh, I guess we can't. What can we do? So I would like to hear a bit more about what the take up has been and and how far that debate is actually going forward in terms of an actual just transition planning strategy.
Jessie, do you want to go first?
Sure. Yeah. Thanks for that great question. So on the first part, the why weren't they prepared, right? I think a lot of the attitude has been like, we'll believe it when we see it, like, and I think similarly to what Ewan and Riyoko reported, like, none of the folks that we encountered are climate change deniers, right? It's more about the pace, right? The pace of this transition and like, and the relationship between these unions and the industry, what it has been like over time. And that has been their main source of information. The companies do not have any incentive to give anybody a heads up about what they're going to do and when. And so they didn't have good information. And that's really why the marathon layoff, I think, was an alarm bell that caused them to say, we need to get some information here about what is likely to happen and when, right? That isn't informed by lobbying efforts from the oil industry designed to change that trajectory, but really understanding what might happen here and what are some paths that these companies might take that we won't be aware of. So I think that's part of it, and I think that's sort of was a similar kind of entropy to what we saw in local government too, of saying, listen, these companies have been here, these institutions have been here, the cornerstone of the regional economy for 100 years, like. When the change starts to come, people are still driving gas cars. Like, we're not seeing these massive changes happen yet, and therefore they were not thinking about preparing for it until they started to really see signs of change happening. On the second question about take-up, yeah, I mean, the first big impact was really informing the state's first displaced oil and gas worker fund. It's a pilot fund to support workers laid off in the oil and gas industry. And our work was influential in shaping that process, as the work of many others. So that's one step forward. I think it's not enough. I think these discussions are very live in the state right now about what they should be doing. So, we released our report and recommendations this year, and hoping that we will continue to see more impact, and that having an actual just transition set of recommendations and strategy out there that is as comprehensive as the work that we've produced is going to be useful in that conversation to say, look, it is possible to actually, this is what it would take to achieve a just transition. So, we know what we're aiming for here and what will really meet the needs of local communities and workers through this transition, taking into full account what they're up against here. So let's get on it. Right now is the time to start actually implementing those plans.
Thanks, Jessie. You then, Riyoko?
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, John. It's good to hear from you. Hope you're well. I think there's a couple of levels to answering this question. The first would be that I don't think, in the grand scheme of things, the closure of Grangemouth, its announcement, was particularly surprising in the kind of longer term perspective. And as we said, the workforce actually expected that at some point closure would be announced. On the other hand, I think there's a couple of important qualifiers to that, and I think it's also revealing of the political and economic structures we're discussing. The unions, certainly under the ownership of the Petro Ineos, have been marginalised to some extent in Grangemouth. There was a major dispute there in 2013, which we didn't have time to go into in this presentation, which led to a significant defeat for organised labour at the facility. And I think it's also more broadly true that the structures of ownership lead to decisions being highly externalised. So the timing of the announcement was surprising. It came in a broad context of increased profitability for the refinery, and actually the refinery recorded a good financial performance in 22 to 23. And in the context of the Russian invasion of Ukraine and very high oil prices. The other factor here is that this is only partially a story of transition. I think in the long grand scheme of things, obviously the closure of refineries is about declining demand for their key products. But right now it's about profitability, and it's about the refinery being replaced with a fuels import terminal, and a broader pattern where Western Europe especially is becoming more dependent on importing refined products from large agglomerations of refineries, primarily in Asia. And I think that's actually a very important phenomenon for explaining the timing of these closures. In terms of our take-up, I think we had a positive relationship with some of the union activists when we did the research, and then the aftermath with the campaign that the union has run. And I think the union also put forward progressive, positive suggestions for retaining jobs at the refinery, and that shaped a national conversation. Our research has been cited by the members of the Economy and Fair Work Committee in the Scottish Parliament, and it was cited today by the UK Climate Change Committee and its advice for the Scottish Government. So at the level of sort of official bodies, we've had some recognition, which is nice, and I think we have participated at some level in a larger national and trade union discussion. But on the other hand, I think when it comes to just transition planning, especially in Scotland, but also across Britain, it comes back to me to that key question of who has the power. Like Grangemouth had been planned for. Riyoko and I have written another article for the Journal of the British Academy that came out recently about Grangemouth as an instance of failure of just transition planning, not because time hadn't been spent, particularly at the level of the Scottish Parliament, to some extent Scottish Government, in considering the fact that Grangemouth was going to be crucial to transition, but because those plans had no realistic bite to them. They didn't have the money behind them. They didn't have the current and future owners of Grangemouth around the table. And I think, to me, that's crucially significant, that one of the problems of the Scottish just transition experience just now is not lack of dialogue, it's who's around the table and who has the power that's been the big problem.
And as we said before, the fossil fuel, oil and gas is characterised by these partnerships with these private listed companies. And INEOS is a really good example of a company that just doesn't turn up. They're constantly invited to discussions around just transition planning. And they've been called out by the Scottish, one of the Scottish Affairs Committee for their lack of attendance, that they're just not showing up. And yeah, as Ewan said, I think that lack of accountability is a massive part of why we don't see more action going on there.
Yeah, I think that's an important point of selective engagement that Petrol anyways didn't. They refused to take part in one hearing of the Economy and Fair Work Committee. They have taken part in others, but they have refused some of these official processes before.
Thanks, folks. I think in the interest of time, I'm going to take 3 questions and then I'll get our panelists to speak to each of them. We are running slightly behind schedule, so if everyone's okay, we might just kind of run over the half-hour mark. But I'm going to invite Lee, Varun and Vivian to ask their questions, and then we'll take those as a block of 3. So Lee, could I have your question, please?
Yeah, hi. Thank you so much for the presentations. That was super interesting. I have a question for Jessie, and it's a very small and practical question. I was wondering, what was your role as researchers in setting up this coalition? Did you have a role in setting up this coalition? Because you mentioned it was both, it was kind of an organizing research project. So I was wondering about that. And also related to that, were you interfacing with workers, or were you only interfacing with unions and kind of like representative level people? Thank you so much.
Thanks. Great question.
Jessica, can we just hold on? We'll take Varun and Vivian, and then we'll answer them as a 3 if that's okay. Varun?
Hey, this was an awesome panel. So I have a question, I guess, for both. But in your projects, where it's fine if this is not this wasn't within the scope of your project, but in your projects, did you come across any feelings of othering or exclusion when it came to the transition process? I know that Evan and team did say the whole part about like we don't mean to come across as climate change deniers, but there's people who are for the agenda and against the agenda. But did this sort of conversation elicit a feeling of othering and exclusion where people felt away from their community as they were discussing about it with their community, which seems to be an important thing to consider when you're talking about just transitions planning in general?
Great stuff. Thank you. Vivian?
Thank you. Yeah, great panel. I was interested in both reports. And I agree with you about the question of power dynamics at the negotiating table and what that means. And one aspect of that is kind of piggybacking on what Lee asked is, how were workers involved? Were they involved, or was it union officers? And how were they involved throughout the process? Same with community members. What are we talking in terms of numbers, in terms of the quality of their participation, and how, and in what sense was there any idea of building power among these groups? Thank you.
Great stuff. That's three great questions. So the first one was more directed towards Jessie, and that was what role did you as a researcher have in setting up the coalition? And then two questions to both panelists. What was the feelings of othering or exclusion in each case, and how were workers and communities actually involved? Ewan and Riyoko, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I think with the idea of othering and workers and these planning strategies involving community, that's maybe I don't think we had time to touch on that much, but it's a really big part of what the Just Transition Commission does in their work around planning for Grangemouth. The workers are the community. They come from Grangemouth, they come from mainly surrounding areas, but that's kind of the history of that region. Is it's lots of towns in hours drive vicinity all work in Grangemouth. Yeah, I think also with how the extent to which they are participating in the project generally. We were talking to union members and union officials, but also more widely in my own research, I'm talking to Grangemouth residents who've been there since the mid-1950s, who've been born there in the mid-1950s. And as this research that we were doing overlapped with my own PhD project, the timing, the people that I was speaking to as part of my PhD project were also involved in the union's campaign to keep the refinery working. So reflections would always overlap. And Ewan and I have gone to a lot of the campaigns and the demonstrations that the union organises, and we see the same faces. And I think that's a really important part of the work that we're doing. It continues because also we care about about just transition and that broader fight. So
Yeah, I guess the only other thing I wanted to add to that is I think it was quite important that these workers felt acted upon, and that was primarily true in the context of their workplace. But it was also true, for instance, when they found out that a Grangemouth Future Industries Board had been meeting for several years that they didn't know about, and the union wasn't very aware of as a whole, actually. That subsequently changed. But I would also come back to the earlier point that there's also big questions about the efficacy of these sorts of organisations in the wider transition discussion around Grangemouth anyway. But I think there certainly was a sense of exclusion from what I've seen as relatively elite policy discussions about the future of Scottish energy from people that are highly skilled workers that have decades of experience of working in energy industries. And I think that does come back to the fundamentally non-participatory nature of the transition, and that's part of the injustice. I guess in response to the other question, the workers are much more powerful than us. We are just two academics who are doing a small part of research, which I hope feeds into and influences in some ways the discussions in the campaign that we regard them as leading. We have retained contact with them, the Just Transition Commission, but also the Just Transition Partnership, which is an alliance of trade unions and environmentalists. And we see our work as, I think, part of those larger movements, which have, I think, much more real capacity for power than we do.
Thanks, guys. Jessie, do you want to comment?
Sure. Yeah. Thanks for the great questions. And nice to see you, Vivian. So on the research and coalition role, yes, so the Blue-Green Alliance and Josh Sonnenfeld, who I believe is listening in on this call still, was the convener from the Blue-Green Alliance and was really the coalition holder and the key organizer of this. We could not have done this alone. We did the research lead, and it was very much in partnership with this key convener organizer role who held the coalition together, really did that in-depth relationship building and structured the whole flow of the partnership in parallel with the research pieces that we were doing. So it really just important to have a dedicated partner in an organizer and convener role and not pretend like the research can hold all of that alone. So first, I just want to say that, and then to answer your question, your second question, Lee, and Vivian's question. So yeah, so the partnership involved representatives, including leadership from the organizations involved. And we met, more or less monthly on the work of the partnership, along with periodic longer workshops on specific pieces of it. We also, throughout the course of the partnership, did engagement meetings, workshops, sharing findings with membership of those organizations throughout. So both the unions involved, the labor council in the region, APEN's memberships at various points along the way to share key findings and discuss with membership. That's in addition to also the engagement of the workers through the study, right, where we surveyed over 200 workers and interviewed, I think, over 20 workers in depth who were laid off from Marathon. In addition, there was a process, community solutions working group, worker safety net working group, various working groups around designing the policy recommendations that involved not only groups from our partnership, but also other organizations locally that are key stakeholders on these issues. So that's sort of what the broader engagement process looked like in the context of sort of the core structure of the partnership. I guess just briefly on the question of othering and exclusion, a core question, a core thing that keeps coming up is like workers and communities, right, as two separate entities here, and like that's a shorthand. I think that is helpful on certain dimensions, but also hurtful on other dimensions. And so there was a lot of conversation about workers are members of the community, and whose community are we talking about, and who lives where, and like whose concerns, and what do people, who represents which communities, and so forth. And so I mean, that's just a live conversation that I think you have to treat with dynamically and be aware of in all of this. And then to the last point, and Vivian's question about building power, I mean, one thing that we talked with a lot about these unions and in relation to the economic development and like building a future economy is just the need to pivot to organizing, right? And we have unions and union locals here who haven't necessarily had to do new organizing in a very long time because they've been representing workers at these facilities. And so it's a big shift to think about what does building power mean in the region, and also what is it going to mean to become an organizing union and go after new industries and new employers. So I think that's very much a what comes next kind of question, and something that we hoped to build a foundation for through this project.
Thanks, folks. There's some really good answers. I'm going to take just 3 questions now from the chat. We've got a question from Marissa, and I think this is in relation to the Grangemouth case. Can the state finance a purchase of the plant and allow workers to run it? So maybe you can reflect on that a little bit for us, guys. And an interesting question from Pax, who asks, how can we ensure genuine transitions to renewables and not false solutions? I'm assuming that's the idea here, that sometimes workers can be sold things like, carbon capture and storage, which is a controversial and yet unproven, I think is fair to say, industry. So maybe both our speakers could address those two, just about how could the state finance, how could the state purchase a plant, and also about how do we ensure genuine transitions as opposed to perhaps unproven technologies. Jessie, do you want to go first? Is that okay?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, this came up a lot. The Marathon facility has reopened as a renewable fuels facility with a fraction of its workforce recalled. Several other facilities have also announced transition to producing biofuels across the state. And so I think there was certainly some hope that like, oh, everything will just stay the same. Our refinery transition analysis dug into some of these questions, really around renewable fuels in particular as like a bridge fuel and like what the eventual fuel mix is and what that's likely to mean for these facilities in California and production. And, essentially coming to the conclusion that refineries will be shutting down, right? That these are not sort of long-term solutions to maintain the level of production business as usual, or the level of employment, regardless of sort of what you think about these fuels as a solution. They're not a long-term way of avoiding transition-related challenges. And in addition, in the economic development framework, those three principles in the Venn diagram, the economic resilience tenet, for us it was very important to define this clearly as we should not be looking to solutions attached to the refinery as economic development priorities, right? Sort of regardless of how those elements play out, and regulation is going to affect that trajectory quite a bit. It isn't the long-term solution that we're looking for, and that the region really needs to be thinking about diversifying its economy and investing in technologies and industries that aren't dependent on a refinery being there.
Great, thanks, Jessie. Ewan and Riyoko, do you want to address the point just about this idea of state financing, such like worker control?
I mean, it would have been interesting if the government had been willing to ask Petro-Ineos if they could buy the refinery for £1, given it was being described as a highly unprofitable, expensive, laggard asset. I think it even being on the table would frankly be a different proposition. The fact that the negotiating position of British government at the moment, and we are in a wider manufacturing jobs crisis in Britain right now, it's important to say. The situation at Scunthorpe Steelworks, which was recently effectively taken over by the government, was that they tried to hand over £500 million to the Jinyi, the privately owned Chinese corporation that owned it, before they eventually effectively seized control of it, looking to then sell it again. I think the thing with the refinery is it probably wouldn't have a long-term future as a refinery, but it has a long-term future as a site of important energy production. Buying it for £1 or trying to might have been the basis to actually then start transitioning it properly, and transitioning it on a basis where we would have at least seen some public benefit. Because I think however it's going to be transitioned, I expect that's going to come at significant public cost anyway. And I think I would like to see in this debate around nationalisation that the Scunthorpe action is kicked off in Britain, a wider realisation of the amount of public money that is going to private companies anyway. Because the debate is, can we afford public ownership? But we should be arguing whether we can afford private ownership and a transition under private ownership. I'm not sure if Riyoko wants to say anything else.
I suppose in the second question, around meaningful just transition, meaningful green technologies. I think in Scotland there's so much work being done by all unions, Scottish Trade Union Congress, Just Transition Partnership, the New Economics Foundation, a UK-wide organisation, into what justice means in a green future, around fair work, community benefits, what green looks like in technology, all part of the same kind of body of work that's coming out, pressuring government to make meaningful change. I suppose in an ideal world, I hope that all these things come together and these things are adopted. But there's so many different complexities in the UK, in the British system, and what that means for Scotland. I also, for the Grangemouth draft Just Transition plan, that was a team of 2 people working on a strategy for a massive manufacturing hub. And I think there's a lot of kind of dysfunctionalities in the system that just make these things really hard to uptake. But there is a huge amount of work being done. I can only hope that something actually be done.
Nice one. Thanks very much, folks. I think that is all the questions. I think I've covered all the questions in the chat, and I don't see any more hands. So we're running 5 minutes over our allotted time. So if there's no more questions, I'm going to suggest that we wrap things up there. Big thank you to all our speakers today. It's been great to have this conversation. I've learned a lot, and I'm sure our attendees have as well. If you're interested in getting involved in our network, then please do check out our website. A link has already been put in the chat. And yeah, I don't think I've got much else to say. Oh, I do need to say thank you also to my TULE colleagues who have helped run today's event. Without their technological assistance, things would have been much less smooth than what they were. So thanks to them, thanks to the speakers, and I hope you all have a lovely day and or evening. Thanks a lot.